Hi, everyone. Welcome to H2omics, the podcast that gives you insight into the world of smart irrigation and sustainability. In this episode, we are honored to have Senator Charles Perry join us. As a dedicated public servant and a key figure in Texas politics, Senator Perry has been instrumental in shaping policies that impact water management and environmental sustainability in the state. With a wealth of experience in addressing water-related challenges and a strong commitment to environmental policy, Senator Perry offers a unique perspective on the complexities of water management in Texas. Keep listening to learn more about his journey, the initiatives he's been involved in, and his hopes for the future of water management. I would love to just get into it and hear a little bit more about your background and what led you to becoming a Texas senator.
Well, good Lord called, I guess, because nobody do this consciously, deliberately on the front end. But I've been doing it since 2011. I was elected in 10 and came to session in 11. So working up pretty close to 14 years and a couple of sessions in the House. And the reason I got in is I didn't care much for the direction of the country. And I was one of those guys that I could either sit around and complain about it or go do something. I don't waste a lot of energy. I either shut up or put up. So that's kind of how I ended up in politics.
And now, do you feel like in the last 14 years, you've been able to make the impact that you were striving to achieve?
Yeah, I've got a list, I guess, of mutual good people trying to pull the cart in the right direction, working with me. We've got a lot of good stuff done. We got some work to do, but generally speaking, I guess the amazing thing is I figured out just how complicated people were and are and their issues, and how not everybody thinks like Charles Perry, which is okay most of the time. It's good to have diversity of opinion, but that we actually do move the needle in a good way most of the time. So it's been pretty rewarding in that. Financially, $600 a month. I think most people think we're overpaid, but I can tell you away from home, community, family, church, and work is a sacrifice nobody can understand, I think, until they've done it. But it's a fun job. It's a privilege to get to serve. I'm, fortunate to get to do it.
And what inspired this focus on environmental policy, particularly related to water for you?
So I'm pragmatic, common sense. I tell people water's life and everything else is quality of life. People moved to where there was water for centuries, not where there was good roads. That came later. So I recognize the value of water and the importance of water, that everything stops and starts with water. And I also recognize that it's the least thing that we're talking about in the policy world worldwide, not just Texas. And I also recognize that we're probably not where most people would think we are because their taps ran today, and that water is expensive. It's decades in the making and it's long term. And it takes a lot of conversation to make people to want to spend a lot of money on things that they're probably never, ever going to see the benefit of. It's pay it forward kind of conversation. So I recognize the value of water where we're not in our water supply specifically. And I also know that I'll probably never drink a glass of water from the conversations I'm having today, but my grandkids will. So it's just one of those things. I just see the value of water for what it is. You can't live without water. I tell people you can walk a lot if your cars don't run because there's no gas. Maybe healthier for you, but at the end of the day, about 5 days, your kidneys shut down and you don't function well. So water's just a non-negotiable that I think we don't realize just exactly where we're at in the water conversation.
Yeah, and it really is the long game of thinking about future generations and how are we setting them up for success, especially when it comes to a finite resource like water.
I share people that, it's kind of like the patients at the ER. We've got a defibrillator in one hand, or we can do nothing. Either one have outcomes. We have the opportunity to recharge and move forward and develop water supplies in the state as well as this world. Or we can sit by and acknowledge the people that are paying attention, what's fixing to happen. And most people don't know what's going to happen and decline to a point of no recovery.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered in Texas?
Well, the biggest challenge is taps came out today. So as long as the taps are running, why are you talking me about water? and people don't understand the fragility of the supply and the pull. Every day, Texan adds 1,200 folks, be it organic or moving in. They're not bringing their water supply. Those folks add about 135 acre feet need for the next January 1, and we're already in a deficit. So I think the challenge is, as long as the taps are running, I don't know why you're talking to me about water problems or challenges. So that's the first level. Once you get past that, it's the long game, as you speak to. It's decades to solve. It's very expensive, um, and it's not very politically sexy to talk about. It's not one of the red meat issues that primary voters migrate to. They don't want to talk about something. I was told by one person it's boring, and it's true. Water's kind of boring, but so it's just not that conversation that most people are engaged in. And very few legislators choose this path because it is long-term, expensive, and hard to explain. So um, the challenge is just the lack of understanding of where we're at in our water supply system.
And how are you getting past that lack of adoption and communication?
So you got to educate the public on what the facts are. The facts are we're behind in Texas specifically, about 10 to 12 million acre feet short of where we want to be by 2050. And our current water plan actually pretty much says that much. So I think people point to a Texas water plan and say, we got a water plan, we're good. But the truth of the matter is nobody's paying attention to the plan because a lot of things in the plan itself have not been implemented, and we've missed the window to implementation, meaning a reservoir put in the books in the 80s or 90s or in their water supply plan now has 1 million people living below it. We're not going to probably do that. So there's just things that I think people uh, don't have time. They're busy. Lives are busy. They just assume the state would never let their taps run dry or the lights go off. But the truth of the matter is, we could if we don't act responsibly and sooner than later.
Yeah. It's one thing to have a plan, let alone implement it. By the time you get around to implementing, the plan might have to change,
Right.
with developments. And how is the state prioritizing water solutions? And if you could talk to kind of the diverse climate that Texas has. I mean, it's such a huge state with, different climates, whether you're in the east or west or north or south.
Yeah, Texas is diverse in a whole lot of ways. Industry segments, we've got production agriculture in the south, in the valley area, and in the plains area where I'm from. We've got oil and gas sectors just to my west and south. We've got economic commerce on the border with El Paso and the valley. And then you throw in all of the Fortune 500s and the tech companies that have migrated out of other places of the country to Texas. Now we're becoming an intellectual hub. We're talking about being a Wall Street in Dallas. So economically, our industry segments, and to our credit, I think our population centers, culture, and expertise and desires are reflected through our industry segments. So, Wall Street probably wouldn't fit well in No Trees, Texas, but it's going to do really well in Dallas. So we're so diverse that we provide something for everybody, as well as a very favorable business environment. We try to be very pro-business because we understand that's what drives economics that move people up in their status in life. So we're a very friendly business, and it reflects every year. Our governor, I think 17 years in a row now, has run the best place to do business. And people are voting with their feet, right? The climate itself, the regional climate, you said it best, in Lubbock, we're at the bottom of the Panhandle Plains, and we'll have cold. We used to get a foot of snow every year, growing there 40 years now. We don't see that kind of volume. Sometimes it hits and miss, but you may have Houston, Texas that has one freeze a year. And then you have the humidity in East Texas, and they're the only part of the state that would argue they've got all the water they need, which I always question. You can never have too much water. And then you go out to far West Texas and El Paso, Texas, it's dry, arid, and humid. So we get our rolling thunderstorms and fun things to watch during the spring up in my area, beautiful. But we also see the hurricanes, right, out of the Gulf. So very, very diverse climate-wise, and the challenges that brings. It also brings benefits because those hurricanes, if they're not too damaging, usually change weather patterns and bring the rains that we look for in the West Texas area. So it all works out. It's never boring. I put
Yeah.
it this way. It always has something to offer in Texas that it's a nice change. I like change of seasons. You can get the change of seasons depending on where you live.
So I want to get into some of the current policies that you think are essential for that long-term water sustainability that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So specifically, our water plan today is a great plan, but it hasn't been implemented primarily due to funding. In Texas, we pride ourselves on trying to not be too centralized and trying to allow the locals to control their destinies as much as possible, and just a whole myriad of issues. We don't want to be that heavy hand out of Austin. So with that came the water plan, and specifically, we've allowed that funding of water initiatives to be more local than state. And what that's done is over time, these projects have gotten so large and so complicated that very few of them are getting implemented now. That's the huge, large regional. So, if I had to point to one thing next session that's a priority for mine, and I'm having great conversations internally with it today, is we have to treat our funding of water in Texas no different than we would treat a road funding model. And our road funding model has been a huge success. We just voted out or actually approved a 10-year road plan. It's every 10 years, every year we update it. $148 billion over 10 years. And the reason there's 14, $15 billion a year going to road infrastructure, and by the way, is the reason we have road connectivity and some of the best roads in the country, is we committed to a continual funding stream a few years back. We committed to a model that said there will always be money in the pipeline for projects to keep going so that there's not this start and stop in the vendor community. Nobody wants to work on a 10-year-old project and worry about getting paid for that work every 2 years in the legislature. So we've set up a funding model that provided the continuity of funding, therefore provided contracting year round and work to be continual. So we've not treated our water that way. We've allowed it to be so localized that we don't have a continual funding stream that can be pointed to do these major projects, these billion-dollar projects. So my conversation next session is to change the model from where we are local only to more of a statewide initiative, no different than we do roads. So if we get that piece right, a lot of the things in the plan are still viable and should be implemented. But more important to that, even, I've got a water grid model, if you will, that we've been working on. And I believe it's got traction to where we're more of a unified connectivity kind of conversation so that we're not doing patchwork fixes on water in local regionals that could have been expanded to a statewide conversation for water gridding to where taxpayer dollars spent more efficiently for the long game, as you spoke to. In that comes new supply development. So it's a critical piece of it. Today in Texas, we treat water supply development as taking from one source and moving it to another. That didn't add any volume to the overall water available for Texas. And so my whole conversation this last 6 or 8 years has been we have to develop undeveloped resources. We've gotten all the cheap water there is. We're at that point where we have to recognize we have to start developing probably less than favorable economic considerations being what they are of developing it, but we have to go down that road. And so what Texas has, and here's the good news, we have undeveloped resources. I've figured out 50 million acre feet per year that could probably be economically developed. We only need about 10 to 12 million acre feet a year on top of the 13 we use. So we have an abundance of supply to develop, and we only need a fraction of that, about 20% of that, to carry us into several hundred years of water supply. So those supplies went out as brackish aquifer development. The majority of those are 10,000 parts and under. Some of them are a little higher towards sea level. Then we have marine desal on the coast that we haven't really invested a lot of capital and time in. We also have the brackish marine and then what's called produced water that comes out of the oil and gas productions. About 10 to 14 million barrels of water per day comes up out of the ground with the oil and gas production. That can move to about 250,000 acre feet with today's technologies and go up from there, and it solves several problems. So marine desal, produced water desal, brackish desal are the undeveloped supplies interior to Texas. And then we have surface water that is not completely permitted. We have some unpermitted surface waters, rivers, streams, that we need to go ahead and follow through and put those into the water supply system. if you develop the undeveloped and add to the overall volume available, you have solved Texas water's problems. And here's the nice thing. It doesn't have a broken heart or a broken family attached to it politically. It's just a commitment, a resource to do it, and a vision to do it. And I will provide the vision of where we can go and what we should be doing and how we should get there, hopefully with all the smart people figuring out the engineering side of that. And I hope the legislature steps up in a big way and jumpstarts the program. And that's where we're at. We're talking about the state taking on the role of jumpstarting or being the banker, if you will, till we get it offline and then when online. And then when the water delivery becomes a reality, when we start growing water from these supplies, then the consumers will pay the state back for that infrastructure cost.
Yeah, that would lead to such massive change getting that pushed
Yeah,
through.
it
And
it will literally be. We always talk about economic development. Texas dominates in so many categories across the world. It will literally take that to a whole different level never envisioned if you get your water systems right. And all we have to do is commit. I mean, we don't have to fix this in a day. These are projects that are probably 20 years old.
right.
I think with the proper commitment, we can move that needle pretty fast, but they're still long-term projects. But when here's the deal. People want to be in Texas. When they see that Texas is addressing that water problem, Katie bar the door. I don't know that there's no top to it.
Now you talked about, the rising economy and all of the possibility of business, but that can only go so far if the water issue isn't addressed. It's almost the foundational piece for that huge potential economic growth.
Yeah, I think we're at that point where that
Hmm.
question's being asked now. Does Texas have water to support me if I put a $5 billion refinery in on the coast? Those kind of conversations. And they're rightfully so do. I think it's been interesting to me that they have not had those earlier. The good news is on those kind of issues, we've got probably less than 10 years to be able to address those pretty quickly. The technologies exist today. They're not something we got to figure out. There's something that worldwide has been done before. So we have an answer for those. We just need to commit to helping get them jumped off funding the financial aspect of it.
Yeah. Are there any policies that you believe could hinder the progress being made so far?
I don't have any policies that prohibit what we're doing. There's some that probably need tweaks for clarification. There's, obviously with produced water, the water comes up out of oil and gas fields. There's some discharge permits that if you're going to convert that to a potable source and discharge it back into a potable system, you've got to make sure all those whistles and bells are connected, and we're working through those and what that looks like. So I don't have any specific policies today that in my mind are hindrance or barriers, and whatever those surface to be, committed to getting them fixed.
Yeah, it's good to hear that, there's always going to be stuff that needs to be tweaked, but to not have anything at the top of the list that's really holding back the progress is good
Right.
news.
There's no
Yeah,
deal breakers today
good.
that you know, November, we'll see.
Yeah.
It could produce its own. We'll see what happens.
So we talked a little bit about engaging the public and how communication is really important. Are there any other strategies that you're using to get the support of the public behind this?
Well, the public's going to be behind it because if you're living in an area where you recognize your water quality is going down, you're having to deal deeper wells. So I'm not as worried about the public as much as I've got to get the legislature updated and educated on where we're at. And that's been not a challenge, but you got 181 people to go visit with. And so I'm making a commitment and have done that with quite a few, but um, most people I've met with, not even really being water, know in their districts some of the things they're facing. So it's become, unfortunately, an easier conversation just by the fact that they're becoming more aware of water issues in their districts. So the general public, there's some things that in Texas we pride ourselves on, private landowner rights and stuff. This isn't going to be a problem for those guys, but initially they're going to be a little skeptical of the state, producing water. So we'll work through every one of those. They're probably the area that becomes more of a relevant conversation. They're probably the area that needs water worse than anybody. Our production agriculture is the one that's depleting faster, and wells are getting more expensive, and they're having to make crop decisions based on that. So I think that the conversation will go really well if we can produce an in-kind water contribution that they weren't counting on.
I'm curious, has smart irrigation or more efficient irrigation been talked about? I think both on the ag side, but also within landscape irrigation amongst municipalities or other
Yeah, so
organizations.
I've been around a long time. I'm old, I'm probably twice your age, but there used to be called federal equip loans, equip money, and it was for farmers to continue to have resources to stay current with technologies. That federal pot of money had kind of dried up over the last few years. But here's what I know for a fact up in my region, and most agricultural people, they're the best stewards of the water they use because it's the most expensive thing they have to pull up, that electricity cost of pulling it. And so most of them have updated to drip, or at a minimum, they're using sensors to know soil quality, soil moisture, soil temperature. They know when to water, how much to water, when it cuts off. Majority of my farmers are using that kind of a technology. If they're not, it's because they didn't have the funds to do it. It's not that the technology didn't exist, but the funding to do it has not always been there at the last. But there was a big move from center pivots to drip. We still have a lot of pivots up in my area. There's a lot of science that goes into, you've been growing corn, the water tables don't support that anymore. But if you switch to sorghum, that's the best cow feed you got right now, and you can get a 40% reduction in water. So all of those researches and all those sciences are still ongoing and will continue to be, because they have to be efficient or they can't survive. And my farmers are probably the most efficient um, folks that use a lot of water. They recognize they use a ton of water, but they do it with the best. The last 30, 40 years, they've been the best stewards of what they're using. And those technologies are not new. It's just, can they afford to implement them?
Yeah, and the technology is constantly evolving and advancing too. So I think that's just going to continue to be on their side.
Right.
So my next question is kind of a magic wand. If you had a magic wand and could push anything into law, what would have the biggest impact on water management?
Water management. I'd create more of it. I mean,
There we
truthfully,
go. That's magic. Yeah. Yeah.
that if I could make all of the world to go day, and I'd say world globally, third world, it's water, right? It's when you put a well in the center of the communities. There was a study done. I'm working on some nuclear power sources because it works with desal. I have to have my power source right. Unfortunately, Texas was just allotted one of the first nuclear reactors, microgridding, that is expected to be part of my desal package in the next 5 years. It'll come to fruition. So I say all that to say the study was done by that friend of mine that's got the nuclear modular that's going to be out and approved yesterday to build by the feds. Came out. Uh, they did a study, and I think it was 200 million hours a day of people in third world countries putting 5-gallon buckets. You see the ladies carrying water on top of their head from miles away, on in bad quality water at that, just started over the next day. If you think about the quality of life, but more importantly, just the productivity, if you can get a well in the center of a town to where they're not making that trek, and it's not an easy track, right? And better quality, then their whole life changed overnight. So bringing that kind of stuff to anybody and everybody in this world that we live in with the technologies that are available, it's just, to me, I would change that in a heartbeat. So you do it one body at a time.
Yeah, exactly. My last question is, what advice would you give to young professionals wanting to make a difference in policymaking?
Policy making in general, if you
Mhm.
have, I would first of all, I had never stepped into the Capitol until I got sworn in on the Texas House floor. We just were poor, we didn't travel. So I don't recommend that being your first exposure to the politics, as being sworn as a Texas rep back then. I would say this: if you have an opportunity to be an intern, and if it's your senior year of high school or one of your college years, all these kids come through the Capitol as interns. And usually, if you've got a higher ed system in your community, so for instance, Texas Tech University is mine, we'll have 10 or 12 kids in the Capitol during session. And just being exposed to how policy conversations go and how they look when they start and how they end up finishing, it's such an eye-opener. You'll either hate it or you'll be addicted to it. So I think if your truly heart is on serving in those kind of capacities, you need to do that internship, because you may find out you don't like it. You don't have a gut for the process, because it's pretty telling on you. But I would say that's my first thing, is I'd tell someone that has a bent towards that or is thinking about it, try to get into a legislative session as an intern. And they're always available, and you'll grow professionally and personally, whether you choose to go down that policy road or not. And then if you do have that interest, there's nothing like, to a question you asked earlier, you just have facts, you know, you just do your homework, you get prepared, you go to battle with the facts. You don't have to exaggerate the reality of what we live in. Just say who it is, put a face on it. I had a fellow colleague here that was here 50 something years. He's mayor of Houston now. And in hearings, he'd always say, put a face on it. Quit talking about all that junk. Just tell him, put a face on it. Ultimately what I've learned over 14, 15 years, you wonder why that crazy law is on the books. And right out of the box, somebody sits down in a hearing and starts talking, and you're like, that's the face. That's why we do this. So, it usually works pretty good. And you just have to believe there's better than worse out there, and you can be a part of it. It's adrenaline, it's fun, it's big thinking. I wouldn't take for the experience. At the same time, it's very frustrating and it's very sacrificial, because to be good at it, it consumes your world. And so, I've got 5 grandkids and a place that's 6 hours away, and so you just do that. But I've seen kids come through this as interns that end up being in politics at federal or state level. That's a great training ground or a great perspective. If you're even leaning on it, you'll know if you want to do it or not. One session's enough. Do it during session. When we're in interim, it's kind of quiet around here, but during session, it's a good training ground.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any final comments before we wrap up?
I will say this too. What we're doing in Texas has application in the national level.
Absolutely.
We have a water problem from Midwest to the Pacific. All you got to do is tour Israel's desal system. It fits like a glove on the Midwest to the Pacific, and would answer California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. It would answer their water needs. It's something that this country should be doing. It will look a lot like the Texas grid, and it's time for a national conversation.
Thank you so much for all that you're doing and for joining me in this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the H2Omics podcast. If you'd like to listen to our earlier episodes, visit calsense.com/podcast or search for H2Omics on your favorite podcast platform. See you next time.